Hello, Silas here, back for a second part of this discussion that I'm having with my friend Steven. You can say what's up to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
And this is a series that we're reading an essay by Herbert Marcuse. And Steven, just tell us a bit about this essay.
Sure. So this was an essay written in 1969. It's called On Liberation. This was written after his three other very prominent works, that is Eros and Civilization, Repressive Tolerance, which we did, Silas read, and we also did a discussion on, and also One Dimensional Man, which talked about crass consumerism and capitalism and how it alienated people and all this. This is his essay written in 1969 after some of the riots that occurred both here and in France, sort of reflecting on how can the new left, as they call it, sort of what strategies can they use going forward to bring about socialism.
Yeah. And with some of the importance of this, Stephen and I and other people who have analyzed this topic and some of the things Marcuse has written, see him as one of the people who has inspired many of the current social political movements in the West and the westernized world, because these are things being picked up by international organizations. And this is something that we discussed in the last part. Is it really westernized or is it modernized? I was talking about that saying, the West is the best. And I'm thinking that more accurate, precise saying would be the West is a current result of the best way of human thinking. And that also includes people like Marcuse having societies and cultures where Marcuse can come up and analyze what is going on in the world that he's living, put this material out there and have other people take that and actually have challenges to the status quo and the establishment. And these people might take power. Whereas in certain societies, previous historical ones or other ones right now, I think you're in a situation where these people would get these ideas and then they would live in a sort of society and structure where if they happen to have the might to take power, they would get to a point where they would completely squash anyone even having, like Stephen and I wouldn't be able to have this conversation, wouldn't have access to this content and have access to other people countering this content and make videos like this where we're talking and having a conversation and sharing this with you out there. There's places where this would just be the way things are, everything else will be banned. And starting to see some concerning things about that. And from reading some of the things Marcuse has written, especially specifically repressive tolerance, which has a lot of influence in society. And I suggest if you haven't read repressive tolerance, you can at least take a pause of this or bookmark it. And it's about an hour and a half reading I have of it. That is very key. That I think will show you many things that you might be wondering about in society right now. It condenses it in a really good way. But this is also more of the thinking because reading that, I was thinking if Marcuse was alive today, what would he think about the current structure? What would he think of the people doing things that are based off of things that Marcuse thought? Because there's a direct line where you can see that I think it was Angela Davis, you said in specific. Angela Davis was one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter social political movement, and she was an acolyte of and studied under Marcuse. And then you look at the involvement with postmodernism and these other things in there. Critical theory takes a lot of things from the things Marcuse was writing. He's involved with the Frankfurt School. And there's people doing things right now, social, like the cancel culture type of things like this, who don't really recognize that it's come directly from Marcuse. If you track back the people who started and the ideas that some of the people espouse, it comes from this. And I think Marcuse would not agree. I could be wrong again, but I think he would not necessarily be comfortable or agree with the way some people today are behaving based off of supposedly the things he was saying to do. I don't know. So that's kind of why I think it's important to hear about what Marcuse said on other topics and expand on those things. Yeah.
Well, to sort of elaborate on the point with Davis, it wasn't just that he was her teacher, that he was like her mentor specifically. Like they talked after class, and he actually got her to go to East Germany and study under Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who came up with critical theory, because they went back to East Germany after the war. Like I guess he helped encourage her to go back and study under them directly. And of course, I guess she earned her PhD there, and then she became a firebrand. The black activism stuff, but also protesting against Israel and other things like that. And of course, she went on to teach as well. She taught Kimberly Crenshaw, who was attributed as the founder of intersectionality and all that. So when they may not cite Marcuse directly, but if you watch interviews with Angela Davis about Marcuse, she'll talk about, oh, he taught me you could be a scholar and an activist. I saw him speak at these Vietnam protests, all this. So there definitely was an impact. Again, it's like they may not mention him by name, but his influence is still there for sure.
Yeah, and that's part of what we with human history. It's another saying that you said in the last part that I think is good to repeat. And this is the way human history and human thought works. Do we repeat things or do we learn new things? And the saying was, instead of saying human history repeats itself or history repeats itself, say history rhymes. And that's because you're using it's human nature, it's humans themselves. So we're going to have certain experiences in different locations, but the biological animal is pretty much the same. There's going to be a point where there's going to be resulting things from humans themselves that are going to be as different as the prokaryotes or whatnot, the lungfish or things that we started as in the primordial pools, where you can say, okay, we are still descended from those beings, but we are very separate creatures from it. And with some of this, I think we are getting to the point where we're going through a massive zeitgeist shift where this was written in 1969, that's pre-internet, and that's one thing that has made human beings different from other earthlings, is our ability to think, imagine, and share information in that sense, and just have a better idea of time and our place in all of this. And all the existence that we know is on this one tiny pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan excellently put it. And you have that kind of situation where now we're getting to a point where with the internet and this advancement in technology that is centered on information, that I think is soon going to change us, at least mentally, in the key part that makes us different from other earthlings, to maybe a different sort of being. And to have any group of people that are against ideas and communication and sharing of information and debating things, I think they are people standing in the way of the human flourishing, the earthling flourishing, and just the success and positive things that can happen. So when I see people talking about that, I want to be interested in why are they coming from that, and some of those people take some of the things Marcuse said. I don't think Marcuse himself would 100% be supportive of that, even though he's said it in some certain ways that, okay, if X, then Y, then we can do Z, then equals Z. So with that, I can understand what Marcuse was saying because he was basing it on a different sort of information. But I'm looking at the information that current people are basing that same calculus from, that I kind of agree with in certain ways, doesn't exist today and won't exist anymore because of the future, the world that we're living in, the playing field that we're in is going to have situations where I don't really see that ability to completely limit that information. This information is out there, so we might as well know as much about it as possible, even if we don't have to follow it, but even to be better to actually address the people that are following it, because those people most definitely are out there. And that's kind of a bit of a ramble, but we'll try to be more concise as we go on. Anything else?
No, that's it. I figured we could jump right in.
Okay. So with this one, we've done a couple of conversations before, and in this one, Stephen actually read the full essay. There will be a link below to it. I haven't read the essay, but he'll just be giving us he's put some excerpts out, so he'll read that, and we'll discuss it. And as I mentioned, there will be some meanderings. I like this general conversational sense that we've had. And for those who are return listeners, thank you very much. And for those of you who are new, welcome to the channel. We do a lot of content like this, and we'll be doing a lot more. And Stephen, thanks again, and let's just get into it. We're on section 1, which is a biological foundation for socialism, right?
Yes. Yep.
Question mark.
Just to be clear, it's a fairly long essay, and I am reading a good portion of it, but I didn't want to read the entire thing. Some of it I feel may be interesting, but it's kind of irrelevant overall. I wanted to focus on the things that really resonate as far as how are these themes being carried into today, and how do you, like, you'll hear certain things in this and think, oh wow, this sounds a lot like what people are saying today. This is likely where it came from. So I wanted to really focus on those. Again, I recommend the whole thing just so for your own sake, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'm just focusing on certain paragraphs. All right. So here we go. In the affluent society, capitalism comes on to its own. The two main springs of its dynamic, the escalation of commodity production and productive exploitation, join and permeate all dimensions of private and public existence. The available material and intellectual resources, in parentheses, the potential of liberation, have so much outgrown the established institutions that only the systematic increase in waste, destruction, and management keeps the system going. The opposition, which escapes suppression by the police, the courts, the representatives of the people, and the people themselves, finds expression in the diffused rebellion among the youth and intelligentsia, and in the daily struggle of the persecuted minorities. The armed class struggle is waged outside by the wretched of the earth who fight the affluent monster. All right. Thoughts and comments? Oh.
Yeah, again, being precise with the language here. Yeah. Marcuse meant really precise things with this, and what he said here, if I was reading the story, or if this is some history, if this is somebody setting up some kind of movie or something, and the script was like, yeah, outside with these people, the people he's pointing out, these dynamics do exist in society, in culture. Yeah. There are people who are the wretched, as he would say, although, as we've mentioned in the previous parts, everybody begins as wretched. State of nature is, in general, kind of wretched. Floor is a floor. That's the natural state of things, is not the flourishing that we have. That's something that is, it's human. I don't want to say it's unnatural, because humans are part of nature, but it's specific to the human animal, the advances that we had. And that comes from us being able to manipulate nature to our benefit. So that's not what's normal. So anything that isn't wretched, if you just don't do anything, if you don't engage in anything human, that kind of, the kind of life that animals live that don't engage in human things, in general, we'd consider kind of wretched. Even as much as people say, oh, we want to let go of technology, how many people just walk out into the woods and say, I'm not going to deal with any human inventions, I'm just going to be out there? You can do that if you want to, but I don't see people doing it.
No.
So in that case, and that's what I'm saying, with those dynamics that he was talking about back then, I was like, did he not consider himself part of the intelligentsia back then? Did he consider himself part of the wretched at his time? And I kind of don't think so. And
no.
And that's something we see with the people who espouse some of this. Are they really? When you look at the people in the United States of America who are in the 1% of the world, when you just look at quality of life in general, it's 350 million people in the United States of America compared to the 7.5 or more billion people in the world. That is the global 1%. So are they the wretched? Who in America truly is the wretched when you're speaking about the human condition? Yes, there are millions of people in poverty, but even the definition of poverty in the United States of America is different than what it has been historically for humanity and today for a majority of the world. So those are the dynamics that I kind of wonder, like, I accept the premise, but I don't accept what would the thing be? The premise he said is accurate, but the
how it's applied, maybe you're trying to say,
yeah,
like,
yeah. I don't accept the applications, or I don't accept the I accept the x like A plus B equals C. I accept that. I just don't accept that the people who claim today to be A, or the conditions they claim to be B, are a situation that leads to the C that Marcuse speaks of. That's the thing that I disagree with.
Because I was thinking of this, like, even though, I mean, he did flee the Nazis, that is true, but he and his colleagues were given jobs at Columbia. Later, he taught at Brandeis and other places. Also, he worked for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. So obviously, the government trusted him enough if they were going to hire him to do that. It's not like they put him on some blacklist. Like, you can make that case with, like, someone like Angela Davis, where she was spied on, she was in jail, the FBI said she was the most dangerous terrorist. Like, you can make that case. But with him, no. I mean, I think, as far as I can tell, I mean, he got a lot of special treatment. I mean, he even helped write the anti-fascism laws in Germany after the war. So, like, it's not like he had no say or anything.
Yeah, well, that was clearly white male privilege that Marcuse was benefiting from, and Angela Davis, as a proud, strong black woman, she was somebody who was persecuted and had nothing to do with any of her actual activities or Marcuse's actual activities. Not at all. It has nothing to do with those things.
I didn't know she was a lesbian until recently too. I didn't know that till a little while ago. I guess she has, like, a female partner.
Extra points for her. Marcuse's son also works at Columbia, and he looks a lot like Marcuse. I'm like, did you clone? Is this cloning? Is this German cloning? What was he doing when you were back in Germany, Marcuse? Hey, Marcuse, what were you doing? Yeah. So those are the things. And then, of course, also capitalism, when it's mentioned in there, I suggest I might put a link here. I have a video also where I read the history of the world capitalism, where there is there actually is argumentation that the way your average Democrat, average democratic socialist, average person on the political left, think about someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when she mentions capitalism, the things she refers to is actually more accurate to the original coining of the term capitalism, whereas free market interactions, free market capitalism, I think is more specific to what people more on the libertarian, the political right would want to speak about when you're saying that. But capitalism itself is a problematic word, and with a lot of these things, the definitions is very important. So it's just something to add.
Well, also the use of the word the daily persecution of minorities, that sounds like a lot of lefties today, where they'll say, like, you'll bring up a police shooting or something, they'll be like, this is what black people go through all the time. They're in fear for their lives. Like, it almost reminds me of that. And as I've said several times now, in the context of Marcuse saying this with the FBI spying on different black groups, the police dogs, all that, like, that makes sense then. But in the present day, no. I mean, does racism exist? Yes. But is there some white supremacist conspiracy to ruin lives of minorities? No.
Yeah. Like, humanity was worse in the past. Yeah. I'm not going to be somebody who's going to deny that. And we have improved. And I do think we have, I know that they often say, oh, we have a long way to go. I don't think there's a long way to go. I think there's a long way we can go. There's no like end point of to go. And I think with some of these people, and what's one thing I object to Marcuse, he seems to have a point in his mind, and he says for the foreseeable future. They seem to be just that religious aspect of it, of this paradise that's imagined. And I don't personally hold that. I think there's this constant existence of different things where when we open new vistas of existence, of knowledge, of ability, we'll have a different idea. Like, in the past, when we didn't understand we were on an Earth, like, we didn't understand there was other continents. So at that time, you're thinking, how are we going to make as good of an existence as possible on this one continent, or the continent that we know of with the resources we have? Then you figure out a new continent. Oh, there's new animals, there's new resources. I just found out that I think they said something like camels or something like that were actually on the New World. I think it was camels and horses were actually New World creatures or something like that. And then they crossed over. I think it was camels or something. And then they crossed over when there was still one of the ice ages into Europe, and then one of them ended up dying off. I think the horses came in or something. I like to double check that. But the whole idea that horses were brand new to the New World, to South America and North America, isn't true, because they were there before and then they died off during an ice age, and then they were brought back by the Europeans. But anyway, that's just showing, like, once new parts are found, new resources are found. Like, before we knew how to use oil and unlock the fossil fuels, unlock the sunlight and energy that had been stored in trees that died and were crushed under the earth. Before we found that, we were like, if you had oil on your land, it was poison. It was like, I want to plant here. I can't do anything with oil. It's useless. Like, it's something people don't want to find. And then we discovered how we can use the energy in oil. And then we're like, okay, now all of a sudden we're looking for these things. So that's kind of what I'm kind of thinking about here, how there's going to be different points where in the world that we think of now, we can think of better ways to do it, but we don't even know what the world in the future is going to be, what humanity is going to be, what existence is going to be. What is a different world when you're talking about going to different planets? When you're talking about resources, getting asteroids and mining from asteroids, what is that world going to look like? What are the dynamics going to be? And I think there's places to go in the future. The future will be better as long as we continue this whole sharing of information and advancement of positive things. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm trying to think if there was anything else I was going to say. No, that's pretty much it. Okay, I'll just read. The critical analysis of this society calls for new categories: moral, political, aesthetic. I shall try to develop them in the course of this discussion. The category of obscenity will serve as an introduction. Obscenity is a moral concept in the verbal arsenal of the establishment, which abuses the term by applying it not to expressions of its own morality, but to those of another. Obscene is not the picture of a naked woman who exposes her pubic hair, but that of a fully clad general who exposes his medals rewarded in a war of aggression. Obscene is not the ritual of the hippies, but the declaration of the high dignitary of the church that war is necessary for peace. Linguistic therapy, that is the effort to free words, in parentheses, and thereby concepts, from the all but total distortion of their meanings by the establishment, demands the transfer of moral standards and of their validation from the establishment to the revolt against it. Similarly, the sociological and political vocabulary must be radically reshaped. It must be stripped of its false neutrality. It must be methodically, I guess it's almost like methodologically and provocatively, quote unquote, moralize in terms of the refusal. Morality is not necessarily and not primarily ideological. In the face of an immoral society, it becomes a political weapon, an effective force which drives people to burn their draft cards, to ridicule national leaders, to demonstrate in the streets, and to unfold signs saying, quote unquote, that thou shalt not kill in the nation's churches. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is another key thing. One of the definitions with the different worlds that we live in. We're getting to a point where we're finally becoming a global community, and that's going to take some time to integrate and understand different people's values and morals and things like that, because those are very subjective things. There are things, a few things like murder, where someone's like, okay, that person, that creature hasn't done anything to you, and you just go out and kill it. Some of those things are very basic and things that are just across nature, not just human nature, across nature in general. Most animals don't just engage in murder, and they just almost kind of doing that thing. But then now when you get into other things, like just take something like bacon. For many people, bacon is just a delicious like food stuff, and in general it's kind of healthy for some people it's not. But then for some people, due to certain morals that they have in their society, it's super insulting to, if they find out that there was bacon in their food, they can all of a sudden take that dish that was tasty to them and that they like to ingest, and due to certain personal beliefs and understandings of the world and the way they view the world, all of a sudden it's an obscene, it's something disgusting that has happened. And I think people need to realize that's kind of how people are associating in the world. We're actually having these clashes of cultures and things like that, where for some people you do something completely basic, and to somebody else it is something very disgusting, very obscene to them. And I remember this one thing. I think I pulled it up here. This is from it says, in Jacobellis versus Ohio, in explaining why the material of the issue of the case was not obscene under the Roth test and therefore was protected speech that could be censored, Stewart wrote, and this was United States Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. He was a threshold test for obscenity. He was saying this. He said, I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, hardcore pornography. And perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it. And the motion picture involved in this case is not that. So this was a case where somebody was saying, oh, this is obscene, it shouldn't be shown, or it should have this kind of rating. And he was like, okay, no, I don't actually say it. And that's kind of something that when you talk about obscenity, and it's like, for me, I do see that. Like, to me, a naked woman is not as obscene as a general with the stars, because like, what did that general do that? He's a member of the state, which has a monopoly of violence over any given area. And I'm just looking at statecraft in the past, and yes, there's some things I can think that was a better war, it's a better way to engage in this war, but that's like, yeah, look, I've killed hundreds of millions of people. I've known hundreds of millions of people, not too many generals have got to that point, but I got these for being really good at killing people, or really good at like restricting people's rights. And so then those kind of things where it's like, okay, I can see the obscenity for that, but then for somebody else might see that and they only see the state as something that has given them their children, given them the environment where they can live in, the protection. So for them, they're like, yes, the troops, they gotta bless our troops. So for them, that is something. But then due to their religious aspects, they might think, oh, somebody having like showing their ankle might be something that they consider obscene because of the way they view like females and relations. So those are the kind of things where it gets very dicey and gets very subjective. And like you said, you see some of this language right now, people talking about things that seem, I'm like, no, can we actually get into the evidence and the actual things we can compare and contrast? Because if we stick in the what seems to be a certain way, that's going to be something that varies across the board for all of us.
Yeah, so I had two comments to make on this. So it reminds me a bit of Nietzsche here. He references Nietzsche a bit later in this essay, but the whole master and slave morality concept, the idea of what did the Greeks and the Romans considered good and bad versus what did Jews and then later Christians consider good and bad. So in Greece and Rome, basically to be good, it meant to be strong, powerful, noble. The men, of course, usually muscular, good fighters. The women are beautiful, all that. But then his argument is Christianity turned all that on its head because it was rebelling against Rome. So then the idea of, instead of sex is a celebration of life, sex is profane and only for reproduction. Instead of war is glorious, war is evil and destructive. And that's that whole Christ supposedly said that whole thing about they shall beat their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not raise sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So, but contrast that with the Greeks and the Romans who glorified war. They had a great warrior culture and things like that. So it kind of reminds me of that, the whole idea of these people are rebelling against the current establishment. So then they turn that on its head and they say, okay, what they valued was bad. What we value is good. And like I say, he references Nietzsche later, but in general, I think this is a very critical theory sort of approach to the culture and morality. If you read a bit of Horkheimer, who came up with critical theory, he talks about similar things in science, like the idea of everyone thought the earth was the center of the universe, and Copernicus and company came along. They were anti-establishment, if you want to look at it that way. And then it served the interests of the establishment for everyone to think, oh, the earth is the center of the universe, but they were rebelling against that. Then over time, that became more and more accepted, and eventually that became mainstream, and then that became the establishment. So I think it's a similar sort of argument with the culture that he's making here. So.
Yeah. And that's something that we do seeing, like people seem to hark back to the past, and
yeah,
I think that history rhyming again, and this happens a lot. It's conservatives are like, oh, we had a better America in the past.
Yeah,
the people on the political left, the regressives, are like, oh, like America is still the way it was in the past. There's a lot of that focus on there, and that could be in part due to the fact that we just have more information about then than the contemporary things that are happening. But I think that's something that's actually transitioning. We're getting to a time when we actually have more information about the present than we do about the past, which is something that's completely brand new to human civilization, human existence, human society. We used to not be able to know. We only knew a fraction of the things that we experienced that were actually occurring in the present. And then we'd find out more things. And now that's the kind of situation that we live in. And one thing with the pacifism, with Christianity, yes, that happens with a lot of religions. You can pick and choose different parts, just like with Marcuse, just like with other things. People pick and choose what they take from it. Because with the pacifism thing, there's been parts of the Christian God telling you have to go out there and capture the women from this place, enslave, kill all the women that have slept with men, keep the kids and keep slaves and things. So that whole pacifism type of thing. And then you look at the actual practice of the Christians once they had power. There's that whole one saying where pacifism is something that is very good for the weak and cowardly, not for the brave and the strong. Like it's not, when you're weak and you're not in power, preaching and encouraging pacifism isn't something brave. It's something that you'd want to do. When you actually have the power, when you actually have the strength, you have the ability to actually go out and take things by force, and then you preach pacifism, that's a different type of thing. And I'm just saying, I'm looking at all the institutions and people that began speaking pacifism. Once those people were in a position of power, did that pacifism continue? And I haven't necessarily seen that happening very often. And that's one thing that I think is somewhat different with the West, and I'm saying that's why I think the West is more the result of some of the best ways of thinking, where you had people get in a position of power where they defeated an enemy in a war, in a battle, and instead of just coming in and just completely erasing those people or just completely subjecting them, they thought, what if we tried to find different ways of doing things? And I'm not saying that is something reserved to white people or the West, but it's something that has been practiced, I think, in the current civilizations that we consider part of the West, more than I've seen in any other society. Like America could swing their big stick a lot more than they do, even though I disagree with the amount of big stick swing that's going on as is. But yeah.
Well, to just add 2 points to that, it's sort of like the pacifism. It's sort of like the free speech thing. Like it's like the side that's out of power wants free speech because they want to appear as, oh, we're being oppressed, we don't have a say. And then once they take control, they're happy to use censorship and other things against people. And that atheist, what was his name? Aaron Ra, or what was?
Aaron Ra is one of the
So he had a good explanation when people ask, like, oh, how did Christianity take root? And he says, he's like, it's very simple. He's like, it caught on among slaves and poor people. Of course, slaves and poor usually outnumbered the rich, especially back then. It spread among those. It became a grassroots movement. It gained enough momentum where the people in power saw what was coming. Some people in power started adapting it, and then it became the establishment, and then it used the establishment to impose itself on other people. And he said the irony is that there are Christians who will explain that to you. They may phrase it differently, but the idea is basically the same. Because one of the things that they talked about in Rome is that unless you were in the upper classes, life was pretty lousy because you had tax collectors exploiting people. You had, of course, slave masters, all this. So the idea of, oh, join us and don't worry, we'll help you do a lot better in the next life and all this was very appealing to disenfranchised people. And the other thing too is like the Romans and Greeks would do a thing if a child was disformed or malshapen, whatever, they would throw them out and Christians would take them in. So they kept adding to their numbers, and eventually it's, wait, there's so many of these people, and that's when the establishment sort of acquiesced, because it's like, you know, we may be rich and powerful, but we can't stop everybody, you know?
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's one thing I've noticed. Most of the people who think good things about history, talk about the good old days, just don't understand history. Don't understand
Yeah.
what the good old days are. It was a bad old days. It was horrible days. It's
Yeah.
like in general, if you think about history, it's whatever you think about history, it was worse.
Yeah.
In actuality, with like actually living that was worse. People who were saying conservatives are more in political right who went to preserve that. I'm like, yeah, I don't think you really understand how bad things were back then. It's not
Yeah.
really a situation. Maybe for certain groups you're focusing on, it might have been better, but at large, it wasn't. And then people on the political left again who say, oh, this is the worst time to be alive. Like things are so much worse now. Like, oh, we're going backwards. And like, no, you also don't understand how much worse it actually was historically. Like, no, this is actually an improvement on history. Yeah.
All right, next paragraph. The reaction to obscenity is shame, usually interpreted as the physiological manifestation of the sense of guilt accompanying the transgression of a taboo. The obscene exposures of the affluent society normally provoke neither shame nor a sense of guilt, although this society violates some of the most fundamental taboos of civilization. The term obscenity belongs to the sexual sphere. Shame and sense of guilt arise in the Oedipal situation. In this respect, social morality is rooted in sexual morality. Then the shamelessness of the affluent society and its effective repression of the sense of guilt would indicate a decline of shame and guilt feeling in the sexual sphere. And indeed, the exposure of the, in parentheses, for all practical purposes, naked body is permitted and even encouraged, and the taboos on pre and extramarital intercourse are considerably relaxed. Thus, we are faced with a contradiction that the liberalization of sexuality provides an instinctual basis for the repressive and aggressive power of the affluent society. All right.
That's a key thing. As life forms, things are surrounded on reproduction, and that's one thing that is very key to remember, and something that did come up last part of the conversation. Where think about people who have kids versus who don't. Like once you have children, there is something about that. Even now, the types of parenting that differs, but even if the people who have kind of bad parenting things, you can say, okay, they might have been somehow damaged as children during their parenting, but they almost invariably always improve on what their parents did.
Yeah.
And there's been a constant improvement for that. That's again, I think people are like, oh, kids have it so hard today. It's like, no, it's always worse in the past. It's something that's been like that. So with this situation, I think when you think about now with how tied in life forms are on reproduction, certain societies, certain cultures certain things seem to be less focused on that, or they actually seem to be taking it out of it. They're saying, oh, somebody shouldn't be attracted. Women should be expected to do this. Men shouldn't be focused on doing that. Like they shouldn't have these masculine traits. But these traits and things and expectations are the foundational things that got us out of just being on that wretchedness state of nature level. We found better ways to gain resources, better ways. The females found better ways to demand males to provide more secure situations and develop societies and cultures and these institutions. So we're letting that go. And we might get to a point where we don't need these similar type of dynamics that we had that organize our biological and sociological evolution, because we're finding ways through technology to continue to reproduce, to continue to do that without sexual considerations being in there. And I think these sexual mores, like when somebody says civilization, before we had this globalized world, when people talk about civilization, they had their gods, they had normally a mono-racial type of situation, or tribes and things like that, certain regions, same kind of like climates and things like that. But now when somebody says civilization, for someone who's lived only in Japan, they might have a whole different mentality of what civilization means than somebody who's lived only in like those people in those uncontacted tribes well, I guess, would you consider them civilized? Well, let's say like some tribes person in Western Kenya who's never really left that area. When they think about civilization, what are the things that they think of? Some common things like cars. Is electricity even the same? Because in Japan you have electricity, but in Tokyo you have electricity, but Kenya is 75%, has about 30, no, 70% isn't electrified. I think that number's gone higher. But anyway, so you have that kind of situation. So what are the things, what are the commonalities in there? Now, when it comes down to the practicalities, what are the commonalities that they have with something that most human cultures do, which is reproduce and have those dealings? So what are the mores? What are those morals going to be based off of those kind of behavioral systems? And those underlie pretty much all these things. And I think if you dig into the actual tensions on this, I think that's why you have women's rights being such a major thing with this gynocentric societies that we have. It's a bit of a rambling place, but I think just touching on that, I think it's very important to remember how much the things in society were created in order to create better environments for reproduction. There's a lot of things that we built upon there. There might be more complicated things, some convoluted, but if you ignore that, a lot of these things don't really make sense. And that is part of the primary things that societies clash on. It's like how the women are treated, how we get access to reproduction. And that's been the controlling factor of how any life form continues to exist as a life form. Yeah.
The thing I would just point out here is I talk a lot about how he was trying to marry Marxism with Freudianism. Notice the words he uses here: Oedipal situation and also repression. He uses that word repression again. That was a big feature of Freud's thing, the idea of a lot of repressed sexuality, which leads to dysfunction. He's sort of tying this into Marxism here, talking about how the affluent society does that and how the bourgeoisie essentially. This was an argument taken from, his name was Georgi Lukács. He was one of the people who, I guess, he tried to lead a socialist revolution in Hungary, but it collapsed and he fled. And he was one of the people who helped found the Frankfurt School. He was very big on this narrative. And I guess he taught sex education and things like that because he was a believer, I guess, that the bourgeois Christian values taught people to repress their sexuality. And that was a way of sort of keeping them in line and not achieving the true consciousness. So he's sort of echoing those themes here.
Yeah. You see, I don't know if it was necessarily repressing your sexuality because, like, I think we discussed before, where Bill Clinton is coming up to have a conversation with current Vice President Kamala Harris on some women's empowerment type of thing, and people are like, Bill Clinton, how could you use Bill Clinton after the things he did? Well, yeah, he did the Monica Lewinsky incident and things like that. That was one thing that's known for. There are suspicions about what happened on a certain person who didn't kill himself's island. Images and flight logs and things like that. So there's definitely more information we don't know about that. But I was trying to think as you were saying that, is it a situation where the bourgeoisie, the upper class, has been more sexually conservative, repressed than the masses? Or has it just been a thing where they portrayed themselves in a certain way, but when it comes down to the actual actualities of it, like you look at another major royal family right now, there's one of the primary members in there, one of the highest members in there is quite tied into this individual that was somehow in a completely surreal place, have a camera go off, and then all of a sudden show up with some asphyxiation type of situation. But so you have that kind of person involved in it, and that's kind of what I'm thinking. I think they were just kind of better at hiding the same kind of base human natures that they had.
Yeah.
And rather than saying that, oh, they're somehow better, where it's the kind of thing where it's not like the classes aren't stratified vertically, where it's like, oh, the lower classes this way. It's more like horizontally, where it's like there's some people who are more on this side of the predilections of their sexuality, and there are other sides who are more conservative. But if you are more wealthy, you'll have more abilities, access to engage in those extreme kind of peccadillos you might have, and also be able to hide those things in a better way than if you're just some lower class person. You'd probably just be like humping people in the street, and you get caught and then you get thrown in jail. Like, oh, look how horrible the masses are. Look how these drunkards are. But then if you're a wealthy person and you do that, you get some little, you don't even hump people in the street. You have a place with some madam where you go in there and that person procures people for you and they hump whoever they want, and those people pay off the police. So you have that kind of situations to kind of cater to those things. So I think those are things that are there that you're going to find that bell curve everywhere that's going to continue to change, and in different societies. The floor is always going to be the floor. Just being a horrific person who assaults people, who doesn't appreciate other people's well-being, that's going to be the floor. That's always going to be there. But then all these other different ways of doing it are going to continue to vary and change as you go to off that floor. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was gonna say like FDR had affairs. John F. Kennedy, how many they said they couldn't keep track of all the women that he brought to the White House. Lyndon Johnson actually died with an illegitimate child through his mistress. So like this stuff was happening all the time. Like, you didn't have media 24/7 covering the stuff, but it was going on. It was just that, JFK might show up on TV with his wife and kids, good family man, but it's like everybody knew what he was doing. And Jackie, I guess, just sort of accepted it, but
Yeah, they were just kind of part of the thing. We have in history people with concubines and things like that. It was accepted knowledge. I think the Anglican Church was in no small part founded part because King Henry wanted to divorce his wife, but he couldn't under the kind of right. So those things were not necessarily just to control the masses. There was also power in having that. I guess you could say maybe the English church had also accepted the Catholic dictates because he understood that would help him have control over his masses that did believe it. So anyway, but it's something. There are systems of control and things like that, and sexual repression is a key part of sexual repression, morality. These are key things that humans deal with, and it's just good to keep in mind. And as you mentioned, that's something that does come up quite often in current society. People talking about, oh, the gays are trying to do this. Oh, the transgenders are trying to do this to these people. Then I'm like, how many people are actually doing that?
Yeah.
And if you're not actually like into being transgender, like, is it really like the school will come and tell your kid, and then how many kids will really change and like, yeah, because it's cool. Like, and the thing is, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Clearly happens and things like that. But how big of an issue really is it compared to many of the issues going on in the world right now? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw earlier, but my friend Nikki had a post from a makeup ad, and it was featuring a trans guy like with a mustache, and she was just like making fun of it. And I was saying like, apparently if you see these ads, they're doing more stuff like that, and if you read underneath, it's all negative comments. And I was saying like, I don't understand the marketing strategy here, because again, trans people are what, like low single digit percentage of the population. Like, you're not going to see a very feminine. Yeah, I can send it to you later, but like, you're not going to see a lot of very feminine women be like, yes, this really resonates with me. It's like, it doesn't, make much sense to me.
And that also just comes down to it. How impressionable are we? Like, is there somebody who's just going to be like a more like bro type of guy who all of a sudden is going to see that? Then he's like, oh, the first time he sees it, he's like, oh, this is horrible, this is disgusting. And then he keeps seeing it, and then by the 30th time, he's like, maybe I want to be a Maybelline kind of guy. Like I don't know if that happens, but I do understand that maybe it could happen when you're programming the kids and things like that. But then that goes back into the parenting or the responsibility of the parents, who like have those conversations with your kids and don't let your kids be so much influenced with that stuff. So those are the kind of things that we just say.
Yeah, because what was I just thinking of? Makeup ads. Yeah, it's like it's a very small. Oh yeah, so Tim Pool was talking about a lot of these ads now will feature like mixed race couples and stuff, and like there's that whole like white replacement thing and whatever. But he was saying the reason they do that is more so they can try and connect with different people. So it's like, oh, there's like a black man, a black guy sees it. Oh, there's a white woman. Oh, a white woman watches it. There's an Asian friend. It's like they're trying to appeal to all these different groups. So it's like each person feels represented somehow in the commercial. That's the strategy behind that. But like that I kind of get. But like this trans thing with makeup, I was just, what the hell?
Yeah, maybe with the makeup, they've already gotten to full saturation, where it's like the number of women that know about Maybelline and are going to use Maybelline are already there. So they might be a small enough contingent. And it's not small enough because think about how often these people use this. Like, and these things maybe make very small margins and things like that, where now the industry's set. There's 10 companies that are dividing the 100 million women in the world that use makeup, and they've all got 10 million each, and they're all getting their profits of that, and they're just at that point. And then all of a sudden, society has opened up to a point where now there's 2 million people, 2 million transgender people globally, or something, or men who are more metrosexual, and they're getting into it. And when you're in makeup, I don't think it's a thing where it's like, oh, I'm just going to use it in one day. It's like you're spending a lot of money. It's $1 billion industry. It's like a multi-billion dollar industry. So maybe that's actually enough to say like, okay, the women just need to be reminded this product is out there. They're going to buy it anyway. So maybe they're trying to get a piece of that pie enough. And as we mentioned with the markets, if it's working, it's working. If it's not, those things will kind of go out. And I think this is something that I am glad about. It seems just even in general, even with women in general, the whole idea of having lots of makeup on is being reduced. And this again is something that historically you look at the people who were able to actually have access to makeup once that thing was invented, the sorts of makeup they had was way worse. The things they were putting on their skin, the things that they're doing themselves, like the wealthy people and things like that, who had the conspicuous consumption type of levels where they needed to compete on higher levels versus just being physically fit.
Yeah.
They were doing some garbage things to themselves. So I think we're going back to a point where people are just going back to just actual health and fitness, where it's like take off all the makeup and the things that you're putting on top and actually just see the person underneath. And I think that's a positive thing, because this makeup thing is more just, again, as much as you hear the occasional women saying, I put makeup on for myself. I'm like, no, you don't. Like there might be a few women who actually just put on makeup. If they were staying at home by themselves, they would just put on makeup and sit there and just look at themselves. But most of them don't. They do it to compete with other women and for seeming attractive to people. That's it. Yeah.
All right. To the degree to which this foundation is itself historical and the malleability of quote-unquote human nature reaches into the depths of man's instinctual structure, changes into morality may quote-unquote sink down into the quote-unquote biological dimension and modify organic behavior. Once a specific morality is firmly established as a norm of social behavior, it is not only introjected, it also operates as a norm of quote-unquote organic behavior. The organism receives and reacts to certain stimuli and quote unquote ignores and repels others in accord with the introjected morality, which is thus promoting or impeding the function of the organism as a living cell in their respective society. In this way, a society constantly recreates the side of consciousness and ideology, patterns of behavior and aspiration as part of the quote-unquote nature of its people, and unless the revolt reaches into this quote-unquote second nature, into these ingrown patterns, social change will remain quote-unquote incomplete, even self-defeating.
Yeah, this is kind of what we've been talking about, and the basic nature of organic matter of life forms is that reproduction. That's that's very genetic in our systems, and this is froze up a bit here. I think I was introducing what is the aspects about our attraction that is genetic and what part is learned, what part is cultural. Some people will say, oh, homosexuality, heterosexuality, that's genetic. There's a predisposition. But is there a predisposition of what males or females find attractive in the opposite gender? Now, is there a racial aspect to that as well? And to that end, I was introducing Kevin Samuels, who focuses on relationships in the Black community. He has a thing on YouTube where he goes and he talks about helping, what does he call them? Like first class or high value men, mostly Black men, find high value black women, or like find he finds gets couples, kind of couple relationship type of counselor person, and he starts talking about the dynamics of the things that different people expect and things like that. And he starts talking about how for higher value men, people who are making like those top level alpha male type of people, the 1%ers who most women are looking to try and capture on the highest rate, they seem to be a lot more racially specific who they actually marry and reproduce with than people in the lower class, you're talking about, where they interact with things. And this is both across all races, and he was pointing that out. And he talks about certain dynamics in there, like you have to decide, are you going to do it this way? Do you want to be a wife? If you want to be a wife, make those decisions earlier. Like, why is there such a why is there such a high level of unmarried Black women compared to other demographics in the United States of America? And it's due to the different interests that they have. And then I recently listened to the Illuminati, and she was doing something on her series. I think it's Corporate Casket. She was talking about the wedding industry, and that's something that's been somewhat interesting to me, because I'm here in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'll see certain things. You'll have some of the traditional marriage type of things, like paying a bride price and things like that. But then when it comes to the actual ceremony, things are meshing. That's what I'm saying. Is it really westernized? Is it really something different? Because they're coming down to that whole thing where you have to have this big party, you have to have the wedding dress. You have to do, like, first of all, those people have to have the engagement with the ring and things like that. So they're talking about how that was developed. Like the De Beers company came from like, how are we going to convince people to actually like diamonds? And that was something that was contrived. And maybe that's what it comes down to, the marketing thing. Like now people think in order to get married, a man, people say in general, a man has to spend 3 months of salary or something like that on the engagement ring. Something some people seem to expect. And that was a marketing type of thing that was pushed, and it was adopted by people. why do women, some women, like you, as you're saying, have this whole idea where they've had this imagination of what they want as a wedding since they were kids. I'm like, why are you thinking about this huge ceremony? Why are you putting so much pressure on that? The white dress thing started by one of the queens in England. Instead of wearing like royal gowns and things like that, she decided, let me wear a white dress and things like that. And that spread around the world. And now people are like, oh, the white dress, the wedding. Why do people put so much interest into those kind of behaviors, and why do those things kind of get developed? Is that natural at all? And they don't think that's natural. It's nurture. But the thing that's being able to build all this nurture on it, all these other industries on it, is that basic drive of there's so much importance in people coupling together in order to reproduce. And then now you have type of situations where a lot of marriages are more out of convenience and don't really relate it into reproduction. And then for those people, is the institution of marriage even a thing to even worry anymore? Like, why are homosexual people who don't want kids trying to get involved into that industry that was built as extra kind of involvement on a situation that is mostly off of reproduction, and the institution of marriage itself with marriage licenses was built because one of the primary reasons was to keep interracial marriages like illegal. Like it's all these kind of contrived things that go in there. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just I guess it's that whole like people just want to be a part of something or feel like they fit in. Like, oh, we're doing it too. We decided to tie the knot too. I don't know. It might just be one of those things. Because like I actually know a woman who married a black guy. Well, I guess she didn't officially, and she said we're actually critical of institutional marriage because we know the history of marriage licenses. And I was like, I thought that was kind of interesting. So, but then like you say with the gay marriage thing, it's like, I don't know. It's like, again, I don't have, obviously being libertarian minded, I'm not religious. Like I don't have a problem with it, but it's just, you do wonder like how that came about. Like, oh, we want to join in too, or, something.
Yeah, and I think there's the social benefits from it. And like you said here, okay, so it comes to the established norms of social behavior.
Yeah.
Now this is part of the issue. It's like, should the public sector be the one who decides what is a social norm? And as too many people who seem to be taking their directions, it's like, oh, if the state doesn't accept me, I'm not part of the social norm. Or we're going to take the orders. We need to control the state so we can kind of dictate the social norms instead of finding a way where you can live and let live, or find a way to actually engage with people and convince them or discuss and see why they disagree with certain things. And because, like I said, some of these things, like who's hurting who, some of these things are this whole situation with the nature of the state, of these victimless crimes. Like if two men want to get married, how does that really hurt me? And if somebody wants to stay at home and be a woman and just be a stay-at-home wife and have 10 kids, why do people say she's enslaved? She needs to be freed and working in a business. And that's one thing that the Illuminati was pointing out. This was a different point of view of the thing, of just a different way of looking at things. She was saying part of why the wedding industry is starting to crater is millennials are getting married later, and she's saying they were deciding to get their life in order first, or they prefer experiences over things, so they don't want to spend so much on a ring. They don't want to have this big wedding ceremony. They'd rather have smaller things. And there's the other side of looking at it. It's like, no, they're just more indebted, or they just less desirable because they decide to pick career. They fall into the whole picking career thing and living, and then they get later on in life when their sexual marketplace value has dropped, so they don't get married as much. But then in the past, what does this past that people think where majority of people got married? Like, no.
Yeah.
When you look back historically, once we left the hunter-gatherer type of state and we started having farming kind of life, it was a point where it was like 30% of the men were actually passing on their genes and 70% of the women were. Like, in general, most humans did not reproduce.
Yeah.
So I think the recent kind of history that we had, I think post-baby boom type of thing, or just the recent history of human history in the West, where there's a lot of coupling, that is something that is rather new in human history. Like in general, I think we're returning to a point where fewer people are reproducing, and that's kind of the typical kind of state of nature type of thing. I don't know.
Well, and I also talked in a previous video too about that whole thing that Tim Pool and I think it was redheaded libertarian or whatever her name was, they were talking about with the dating apps, the whole eugenics effect, whereas like people like my grandparents, they just met because they lived near each other or something. Now a woman can go on a dating app and meet whatever guy she wants. If she's attractive, she's going to get a few hundred messages or whatever. Guys, it's tougher because a guy with like in college or just out of college, he's not making much money and all that. But some of those women will think, wait, here's a guy who's established in his career. He has a house. He doesn't have debt. He has money. Who am I going to go for? And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, they're acting in their own self-interest, but it has really changed the dynamics compared to what it used to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's simple things, and I do understand the unnatural nature, the artificial nature of the state. It's a social construct where females can be supplied resources to reproduce via the state garnering resources from a majority male tax base in that sense. So you have different considerations. That whole hypergamous nature, that whole nature of instinctually can't really get themselves to be attracted to a male that is not making as much as they are. And on top of that, you normally compare the males to the other males that are in your vision. You know, it was the kind of thing, and that's how genetically it was. If you were living in prehistory type of time, pre-Bronze Age, you lived in that village, whichever men could get as many resources got as much female attraction. You look at apes, whichever male primary gorillas out there just wrecking shit, all the women are like, I need that guy. So that's something that's kind of been genetically coded into us. And now you have a situation where you might not meet Elon Musk, but you can go online and see Elon Musk tweeting every day and feel like you know this guy. Feel like there might be some subconscious thing somewhere in the back, like, well, Elon Musk tweets as well. So this guy is making like $50,000 and I have access to him. I might not meet Elon Musk, but if Elon Musk is doing the same thing as this guy, I might meet somebody who's like halfway between them sometime, and they might let that guy go with those kind of ideas. So those are the kind of things. It's an interesting time to be alive, and I think those are the things that are going to change who the human animal is when it comes to that social mental type of thing. I think our evolution is going to change in many different ways. Yeah.
You just reminded me of my friend Jacqueline. She's a big fan of James Lindsay. Says she said he's one of her celebrity crushes. She's like, I got him to. She said I got him to talk to me. I thought that was kind of funny. And then like he actually reposted some of her stuff, and she was so happy. I'm like, can you get him to talk to me too? I was like, because you've seen Stephen Hicks and others have commented with me, but I've met him in person, so it's like he knows who I am. Whereas like if James Lindsay gets all these messages, some people like him, some people hate him. It's like he's not going to stop and respond every single one. It's too much. That's funny.
That is interesting because like with the polyamory thing, for some people it's completely okay, and historically it's been a different kind of thing. I think for some people and that's different things. And you look at different life forms, different animals, and human beings have the mental capacity to match and live in different societies with different dynamics and things like that, and adjust to them and find comfort in them. And for some people, they might be more comfortable with a polyamorous type of situation. For some people, they truly might be happy saying, like, there's people who are into like BDSM, there's people who are into like different kinds of sexual peccadillos, and like people who like threesomes and things like that. There's people who are just like, no, I don't really want too much sexual interaction outside of just reproductive stuff. So those different things, I think they definitely are social pressures and things like that, where people might think they want to do one thing, whereas if you had a situation where there was more access to other things and less social taboos, but then at the same point, that's what I'm saying, like still the West is the best place to be any one of these kind of these queer, unusual type of things that go against whatever people in that area you're doing mostly do. But most other places in history, most other places in the world, I see what most people do is what is actually forced upon, taught to the rest of society in a lot stronger way than in the West.
Yeah. All right. It is not simply the higher standard of living, the illusory bridging of the consumer gap between the rulers and the ruled, which has obscured the distinction between the real and immediate interests of the ruled. Marxian theory soon recognized that impoverishment does not necessarily provide soil for revolution, that a highly developed consciousness and imagination may generate a vital need for radical change in advanced material conditions. The power of corporate capitalism has stifled the emergence of such a consciousness and imagination. Its mass media have adjusted the rational and emotional faculties to its market and its policies and steered them to defense of its dominion. The narrowing of the consumption gap has rendered possible the mental and instinctual coordination of the laboring classes. The majority of organized labor shares the stabilizing counter-revolutionary needs of the middle classes, as evidenced by their behavior as consumers of the material and cultural merchandise, by their emotional revulsion against the nonconformist intelligentsia. Conversely, where the consumer gap is still wide, where the capitalist culture has not yet reached in every house or hut, the system of stabilizing need has its limits. The glaring contrast between the privileged classes and the exploited leads to a radicalization of the underprivileged. This is the case of the ghetto population and the unemployed in the United States. This is also the case of the laboring classes in the more backward capitalist countries. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the key things before I looked a lot more into politics, which has been, I think, the last 10 years, I got a lot deeper into it. But some of my early observations when I was still in high school in the United States of America, I was living in the DC area, and I realized that, hey, like, Washington, D.C. is supposedly the most powerful city in the world, where the most powerful person lives in the White House and things like that. And then you have, at the same point, in the ghetto areas of DC, it's improved, it's gentrified a lot, which has actually improved the quality of life for everybody living there, including the black people. Yes, some of the people had to move that, but let's not get into the intricacies of that at this point. But it was like the murder capital was very often Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, you're sending troops to Iraq to somehow secure things out there, yet there's people in your country getting shot like 30 minutes away from where your president lives. And those gaps there, at that point I was seeing those gaps and thinking, oh, that's still horrific. That's horrible. That's why we're living this time where this gap has split. But then he's talking about the consumption gap closing. And I think that's actually more accurate that right now in the West, for sure, like the real, when it comes to practical matters, the difference between the most wealthy people and the poor of the United States of America is a lot closer than it was when you had people in like castles versus people in like this mud huts, like people like peasants. Like the peasantry, the masses are not as much in dire straits. Like when it comes down to the actual aspects, yes, there's some things where that gets absurd, where somebody can own a Bugatti who's like $1 million car and things like that. But most of the peasants have a car.
Yeah.
It might not be a Bugatti, but they have a car. But in the past, it was like the people in those castles had their horses and the chariots. But the peasants had to walk everywhere. They didn't have any access to any other kind of transfer. They didn't have any assets to just the basic things that just improve the basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs were not achieved. Like to be a peasant back then, you were missing most of them. But right now, to be a peasant in the West, you have the hierarchy of needs taken care of in general.
Yeah.
Now the surplus consumption and things like that, you can do a lot more now if you're wealthy now than you could in the past. But those basic levels, I think those gaps are actually kind of a lot closer today than they were in the past.
Well, they made that point too, that if you look at poor urban areas today, like look at what the market provides versus the government. Like somebody made the comment, there's more nice cars and nice schools in poor areas. And like, there's probably some truth to that. Like, you see that joke kind of messed up, but about like the rich kids sell their Jordans to buy drugs, the poor kids sell drugs to buy Jordans. And, that doesn't mean that obviously people living in poor areas have it easy, but like you say, that consumption gap has narrowed. Like poor people have iPhones, poor people have air conditioning. That used to be a luxury. Like things that were luxuries became commonplace. But all the things that the government runs, schools, a lot of this public housing, it's a mess. It's like, and that's the argument is that with competition in the market, these things would get progressively better because there would be an incentive to actually improve the quality of these things, or someone will come along who will.
Yeah, and that's one of the key things that I think has come up with Marcuse and a lot of other people in the current year is they point out problems that I think you and I both agree are problems and issues, but then the solutions or how they say we should address that kind of changes. That's very key.
Yeah. And then what else was I going to say here? So it talks about mass media, about sort of, I guess, preserving itself. I actually do sort of agree with that. Like that's why the media is focused on identity politics and things like that, because they don't want you to understand like, okay, how does the Federal Reserve work? What is that doing? How is that robbing us? Like they don't want people to know what the real problems are. They just want to misdirect people at each other. So I agree with what he's basically arguing that the media is conservative and about maintaining the status quo. And I agree with that, but not in the same context in which he's saying it. Like, I agree that they want, it's about sensationalism and it's about pitting people against each other so they don't unite and see who the real enemies are. But again, like like him saying what he's saying then, now it doesn't really hold water.
Yeah. And there's something going on in the West right now, especially United States of America, the dynamics of the political parties. They used to say the Democrats were the working class party, and now that seems to be a lot of working class people going to the Republicans. And they were talking about this, whether that characterization is accurate or not. I'm not going to go over it now, but there definitely is a talk about a reduction in the middle class, and that is one of the few groups that seems to be reducing, at least what's referred to as middle class in America, which is, as I said, being in the 1% of the world that's wealthy in every other, most other countries. But here he says the majority of organized labor shares the stabilizing counter-revolutionary needs of the middle class, as evidenced by their behavior as consumers of the material and cultural merchandise, by the emotional revulsion against the nonconformist intelligentsia. There is something in here where they're talking about, so organized labor, are the unions really part of the middle class? Do they have the similar things as the general middle class? Like, who would you consider the middle class here? And that union jobs used to be kind of ways to get yourself into the middle class. Like majority of middle class people in the United States of America, I think in the 50s, were working in unionized sectors. And that seems to be something that doesn't really seem to apply anymore in an extent. And are they joining some of the middle class? And then they talk about the consumers of the material and cultural merchandise. I think that definitely is something that's done by the middle class, but do the poor people not? Do the wealthy people not? I think they still do that. The wealthy people just do it on a global scale. And the emotional revulsion against the nonconformist intelligentsia. Now, here is a very key term, because when you have people on CNN thinking they are the nonconformist intelligentsia, I'm like, no, you are the conformist people right now. So it's like, who's the actually emotionally who's actually emotionally revulsive against the nonconformist? Who is considered the nonconformist intelligentsia in the world today, in America? And are the unions really against the nonconformist intelligentsia? Would people claim that with the majority of the unions voting Democrat, voting for the current administration, would they say the current administration is nonconformist? But nonconformist to who? They definitely do consider themselves to be the intelligentsia, the most educated people, and things like that. So that's kind of interesting to see there.
Well, what I was going to say on that too, I'm trying to find it here, but James Lindsay had a good tweet about why they hated the MAGA crowd, because you think about it, MAGA was a lot of working class people, but the Marxists see it as, well, the working class is supposed to be on our side, but here they are, they want freedom, they want to be able to live their lives, all this. And that was what Marcuse himself was struggling with, like I mentioned in the last video about meeting with the auto workers. Hey, are you guys unhappy? Don't you want to change the system? No, it's not perfect, but we're generally happy with what we have. And I think Marcuse sort of expresses, and I'm sure some of them are too, they're sort of that contempt for those people, because it's, oh, well, they even say it. They say, oh, they're voting against their own interests. They see it as, we're speaking on behalf of the workers. They should be on our side. They're supposed to work with us. And of course, they leave out that, no, these intelligentsia, I mean, some of these professors are making six-figure salaries. They're given all this prominent speakership, all this. It's like, you are the establishment and you're claiming to fight on behalf of the little guy. But then, of course, the actual workers are seeing this and they're like, no, you're not on our side. And then, but I think that's why there was such that vitriolic hatred towards the MAGA crowd, because of that dynamic.
And maybe in that sense, they are nonconformist, because yes, they have a control over certain places, but you look at some of the ideas of the regressives, and they're not that popular when you actually talk about the details.
No.
You look at the actual viewership of these channels, and it's not really that popular. They might have the ears of people with a lot of power, but do the ideals that are espoused on CNN, MSNBC, from Columbia University, from these institutions, do they really conform to the general way that people in the United States of America and the rest of the world actually exist? And in that sense, they actually might be the nonconformist intelligentsia, that they have to find a way to divide these groups and do that identity politics and find a few things in these different groups in order to convince them that, yeah, vote for us. Because if they just said this is who we are in general, they wouldn't be able to be popular enough to maintain enough support. So they try to focus on a few issues here and there, because they actually don't conform to what most people actually consider to be positive or desirable. So there could be something in there.
Well, because I was thinking, the two examples of this, there's that expression, get woke, go broke, that things that go woke get tanked, like the female Ghostbusters. There were a few video games. There was the Birds of Prey movie, a few different things. And also even the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, like they were pointing out that Dave Chappelle thing, the audience loved it, the critics panned it. But then there was that one, was it Bringing Down the House about the squad? Critics praised it, audience trash it. So it shows that disconnect. But they due to the nature of this ideology, and Marcuse, I think, embodies this idea of we're speaking on your behalf. We're doing this for you. We're helping to usher you into the ideal society. But of course, the masses are looking at what they're selling and saying, no, I don't want to be a part of this. Oh.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. All right. All right, let's see here. In the advanced capitalist countries, the radicalization of the working classes is counteracted by a socially engineered arrest of consciousness and by the development and satisfaction of needs which perpetuate the servitude of the exploited. A vested interest in the existing system is thus fostered in the instinctual structure of the exploited, and the rupture with a continuum of repression, a necessary precondition of liberation, does not occur. It follows that the radical change, which is to transform the existing society into a free society, must reach into a dimension of the human existence hardly considered in Marxian theory, the biological dimension in which the vital imperative needs and satisfactions of man assert themselves. Inasmuch as these needs and satisfactions reproduce a life in servitude, liberation presupposes changes in this biological dimension, that is to say, different instinctual needs, different reactions of the body as well as the mind.
Again, I like the way he writes.
Yeah.
Put it that way. I mean, I'm a fan of language of things, and I think he's very exacting, and he writes in a very compelling way.
Yeah.
And some of the things he says, I'm agreeing with here. And again, now I'm also trying to think, like, if I read this when I was 15, would I really understand some of these terms and ideas? Because I'm trying to think, like, is this appealing to me, or is this somewhat communicative to me due to my current mindset?
It's interesting though, because some people have said he's hard to read. I think he's fairly easy to read. I mean, the stuff that I've read, like you have to know like certain things because I've delved into philosophy. Like I know when he talks about Kant in one of the next sections, like I know some of that stuff. Like if I hadn't read any of this stuff, like it might be tougher, but like because I know some of the background, it's a little easier. They said Adorno is very hard to read. Like it's very dense writing. Horkheimer, similar thing. Like Horkheimer is a very solid thinker. Marcuse even said he was a genius, but like he's one of those that he references all these philosophers and things. So it's like, unless you have that background, it's like, it's a little harder. But I think once you start to make sense, you're like, okay, I know who he's talking about and what he's referring to and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is why it comes to the thing, like, could people read this and then get that he's saying some stuff that kind of makes sense, but they don't get some of the parts or the applications of it, and they kind of lose their way. And then that's part of why we have the conversations like this, where we're trying to talk it through. And I don't want to project my understanding of these on people, because that's what I'm trying to see. Like 5 years ago, would I have understood this? I think so. 10 years ago, like 15 years ago, when I was 15, like I don't know. maybe I wouldn't have. It's like, how do you get people to understand the thing that he's saying here? And could the people who have trying to learn or trying to do the things that he said just be doing it from positive reasons, but just misunderstanding some of the things that he was saying here? I don't really understand, because he says if you're invested. Go ahead.
Because even the way he uses, like he even uses that word libertarian early on, but he uses that to talk about the anarcho-communist flag. We wouldn't hear libertarian and think of that. So, or even just the essay itself, liberation, but liberation from what? He's saying liberation from capitalism. That's the whole purpose of critical theory. But it's like, when people hear liberation, like when I hear liberation, I think, okay, government deregulating and things going private. They hear liberation, they think somehow becoming socialist. But then he also criticizes bureaucracy. So that raises the question, how would you achieve this? And like we say, it's magic thinking. Like, yeah, the vision of it is beautiful, but it's like, it's not clear how and why we could get there.
Yeah, and you see here he says a vested interest in the existing system is thus fostered in the instinctual structure of the exploited, and the rupture within the continuum of repression, a necessary precondition for liberation, does not occur. Yeah. And with that, I can kind of that makes perfect sense. Like, yeah, that's accurate. I don't really see any problems with that. Like personally, I used to be a lot more. I'm still dealing with weight issues, but I remember being a lot more obese and like I was very obese, and the issues that you had, you somehow instinctually, whatever you're doing to your body, there's some investment in being in that state. I didn't consider myself healthy, but it got to a point where there was enough things in my life just I'm like, yeah, I know I'm harming myself. I know I'm in this situation that's not necessarily positive, but there was enough things to be invested in that where you're like, okay, I'm not going to get to this. Then there was a breaking point where I was like, okay, I got to change my life. I got to get out of this. And then now that breaking point happened, I liberated myself from that mindset and then moved on. But then I see a lot of people who just get stuck in that place. And that's part of why I don't like the fat acceptance kind of movement. I prefer
Yeah.
fit awareness over fat acceptance because it's getting people to accept a structure where they're being exploited by the multiple industries that benefit from them consuming the amount of calories and things and foodstuffs that they actually need to maintain that weight, and the other people who then again depend on them. The medical industry, in a way, actually benefits from as many obese people because people have more health issues, and then they actually go in and use more medication and use more services and things like that. So there's that part in there. But anyway, now when it comes to things like you're talking about earlier with like the Roman system, when they adopt the Christianity, it gets to a point where enough of the people are like, okay, we got to actually get to this, and those people adopt that, and there's actual change. And right now in the United States of America, there's been a few mass shootings of the right kind to get enough coverage versus the ones that happen in the inner city on a daily basis, to get the gun control thing upcoming. And then with the pandemic, some people were saying, oh, I didn't expect, I don't know if this was, I think it was Dave, who's a libertarian comedian? He has a
Dave
podcast.
Smith, David
Dave
Smith,
Smith,
Dave
yeah.
Smith. Yeah.
He posted something saying that he didn't expect, this is paraphrasing, he didn't expect people, conservatives on the right or people on the political right, to just accept the shutdowns and lockdowns in the way that it did. So he's unsure what's going to happen with the guns. Like now that they're talking about executive order for common sense gun control. Whenever someone says common sense, it's going to be very uncommon and nonsensical. That's almost guaranteed when somebody says something like that. But somebody wrote there, it's like, I think people have actually drawn the line on guns, where it's like these other things you can adjust their lives and you can do it slow drip enough where they're like, okay, you're limiting me to move a bit, you ask me to wear a mask, but I can still do most of my things. But when it comes to securing themselves, that might be the line. So that's the kind of thing that you kind of wonder, are we in a situation where people are just bred in circuses, maintained to enough where they're entertained enough, they have enough good things and positive things in the system that you're not really getting into a situation where you'll see enough the preconditions for that liberation in that sense we're talking about, bring out the guillotines and hang the rich and actually eat the rich. And in that sense, I kind of agree that humanity has gotten to the point through the West and the best of the things that we had where there will be changes to systems, but I don't think we're going to get to a point where humanity crashes enough to the point where they go to those massive violent eruptions of just murder and wretchedness in order to liberate themselves to this next positive point that we're actually going to get to, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's funny because I find myself, it's like I agree with him, but for a different reason. Because when he says, no, because what he's talking about, like the people in power benefit from things being a certain way, so they're going to uphold that. But he would argue that's the bourgeoisie upholding the current status. I would say it's more the government and people connected with them. Like, some of it, are they capitalists, sort of, but they want all these privileges and everything maintained. Like that was, I don't know if you saw that thread I posted from Spike Cohen talking about like, why does healthcare not get fixed? It's because all these people benefit from the status quo. So they're going to give you all these BS reasons and just dance around it, but they can't turn against the people who funded their campaign. So they'll give you all these excuses. But, is that capitalism? I would say no, because you have to go through those companies. And then that's the talk of, if the system gets so terrible they impose socialized medicine, well, you still have to buy from those companies. That's like what happens during war. All these companies get defense contracts for war. Well, millions of dollars comes pouring into those companies. It's great for them. So that's sort of the angle. So they can't get into it from a true fundamental level and explain, okay, what's really going on here? Because then it's obvious, okay, you're just being bought off by people who are benefiting from the status quo, and they don't want to say that out loud.
Yeah. And it's easy to focus on, point at the top politicians, the representatives, who are just figureheads. These people just switch back and forth, as we discussed, where it doesn't matter who the Republican senator from Alabama is, they're going to vote the same way. Like there might be 5 people who actually run for it, but if they actually get in, they might be two or three out of the hundred of things they vote for during their term that might differ due to the personality of the person, but everything else will be down the line Republican votes that you can expect. And but when it comes down to it, there's still a lot of just regular human beings who benefit and support that system, who are either like the amount of people that are involved in public sector jobs. Like when you have an infrastructure bill coming up, how many people just making $60,000 with government benefits and a pension are going to be there? You have these massive bills coming out, like 1.9 trillion being given out. You're like, oh, let's go to all this debt coming. Oh, this government people, these politicians, Nancy Pelosi and things. Like, is it really when you have a situation where we're going to have a situation where in this bill we're going to guarantee the biggest teacher union pension plan gets paid through 2050? Rich people who are like, yeah. Is it still recording?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of average people who are just like, yeah, we're actually benefiting from this. So
yeah,
in a sense, they'll get their small piece from that. Now, that person is not going to get to a situation where they might be uncomfortable with their situation, but because they understand for their foreseeable future, as we discussed, they think they're going to be taken care of. They're not really concerned about what's going to happen 200 years from now when that bill comes due. They're going to be already gone by that point. And when you have something like, oh, there's $10 million being given to Afghanistan for gender studies, they're not necessarily thinking, oh, this will actually help the Afghani people. They're like, no. I have taken a gender studies degree, and this is a job that's going to get me in a situation where I can continue to be alive and possibly meet somebody and get a family and get a reproduction. So they also just have their personal interests in maintaining their livelihoods just as much as the factory worker who, with these kind of things, might have a situation where the job is actually offshore and they're out of work. So they might have separate interests for their other things. So those are the dynamics that I think exist.
Well, it's important to look at the power behind the throne too. Like Tim Pool's been talking about BlackRock lately. That's one of the biggest investment firms. They manage 8.7 trillion in assets. So like think about that. So it's one of those things. Yeah. And the thing is, they're not an investment bank. They're an asset management firm. So they'll do things with hedge funds, for hedge funds, things like that. But if they're in trouble, I mean, you talk about too big to fail. I mean, that's too big to fail on steroids. If they're currently in the White House, one of their people is the economic advisor, and that was interesting during this whole discussion about the short squeeze with AMC and all. They doubled their holdings in AMC, and that sparked a lot of interest for people because legally, when these big companies buy stock in large amounts, they have to report it because it has to be disclosed. But when they doubled their holdings, that caught everyone's attention because it's like, if they manage those kind of assets, they know what they're doing. But that's probably a good sign you should buy in because a company with that kind of money is not going to mess around. So that's why they're wondering, do they know this short squeeze is going to happen, but they're going to own millions of shares. So when those shares go way up, they're going to make millions and millions of dollars. Yeah.
Like 8 trillion?
Yeah, 8.7 trillion.
I'm just taking the GDP. I know GDP is a questionable thing on what it actually covers and things like that.
Yeah.
There's a difference like the GDP and then the actual spending of the governments. So most governments spend a lot more than their GDP every year. But I'm just checking like the actual GDP of the United States of America was 19 trillion. I think this is from 2007. It's by Worldometer, and China was 12.2 trillion.
Yeah.
And then that's it. The next one is Japan at 4.8 trillion. So this BlackRock controls more assets than every country in the world besides the United States and China.
Yeah.
And if you take its share of the United States out, it controls as much as the United States. Only China controls more. But then now with BlackRock's assets, I'm sure some of those assets, it's probably like 5 trillion in the United States, probably 2 trillion of China's is somehow tied into it. That get billions out of the other countries that are involved in here. But that is crazy.
Yeah. But they've said that
what are the top people of this thing?
I'd have to look, but they've talked about how they work with other hedge funds and things. And what's interesting is that one of the hedge funds that's shorting, they were shorting GameStop. They got in trouble with BlackRock because they borrowed BlackRock's shares to do it. And BlackRock is saying, give us our shares back. And I guess they had done business with this hedge fund in the past, but I don't know if BlackRock is suing them directly, but this one firm, Melvin Capital, has like 9 lawsuits against it now. It's pretty crazy.
These are the kind of people. There's this great book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good book.
Yeah.
I read it. I might reread it or re-listen to the audiobook and see if I change my mind because I think this was before I really got into like economics and but some of the things they were saying were just practical things that were being done. It's definitely not capitalism. It's some other beast in there. And I think these are the people that moves and shakers. These are the kind of people who are like not they don't have economic hitmen for sure, but I'm sure they also have like actual hitmen who are
Yeah.
like, no, we're gonna nip that guy. Because it's like you're controlling that amount of money where you could like it's just practical human nature. If it's like, okay, we can spend $1 million to really pay off everyone in this place, get the right people to disappear this person in this one location, and we can show you by these calculations that will garner us $1 billion contract.
Yeah.
They're not going to do that. Come on, that person is gone.
Well, you're seeing the reverse happen too, because they're talking about some of the fines that they have to pay. Like, for example, you're supposed to report how many shares you short of stock, and JP Morgan got in trouble a few years ago because they actually lied about how many they were shorting, but they only had to pay a fine which was in the low millions. But remember, JP Morgan is like the fifth largest bank and they have several billions. What's a few million to them? Citadel, one of the groups that's in this short squeeze, they paid, I think it was like 275K for underreporting. What's 275K to them? So they're willing to say, get it for them, it's a slap on the wrist. Oh, sorry, we won't do it again, and they're fine. Whereas with the short squeeze, they have to buy back all these shares. They could lose billions of dollars, but that's going to hurt them big time. But again, they're willing to say, oh, we're sorry, and pay a little bit in fines, and they're fine. Like, I think the CEO of Citadel makes $1 billion a year, I was reading. Yeah. So yeah, like what's 275K to them?
Yeah, that's the gap we were talking about, where the top of the top, yes, the gap
Yeah.
is infinitely higher than it was in the past. But then also in those past that we're talking about, pre-industrial revolution, when you had empires and things like
Yeah.
that, there were certain royal families that did control equivalent of this, if not more. Like when you had something like the Roman Empire there,
Yeah.
the parts of the world that were part of that idea of civilization, that's not counting the Chinese Empire. But even when you look at that, the Chinese back then in the Great Dynasty times, that China knew about the world. It wasn't connected to North America. Didn't know what the Incans and the Mayans were doing. So that sphere of the world that was theirs, the people that were actually controlling things, actually had this level of control, if not more. It was like one family, one. It was like 0.0001% of the actual place had ownership or actual relative control over like 99% of the actual world. It wasn't that kind of situation where even with this kind of situation, it's still incomplete and they have influence, but it's not as open, as known, and as direct as it has been in the past. So it's still absurd, but
Well,
it's still an improvement to the way
what
things
was it?
were.
The East India Dutch Company? They say that was the wealthiest country in history, be worth several trillion by today's dollars. And they said, like those companies had more power than actual nations because they were funded. It was the mercantilist system. They were funded through tax dollars. They'd go out, explore, conquer, ship goods back. And they ended up accumulating a vast armada, weapons, all these resources. So they could have taken on some of those countries if they wanted to. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think these kind of companies still make or break a country. Like definitely
yeah.
BlackRock has more power than I think every country in Africa, maybe besides
Yeah.
South Africa or something. But
Yeah.
like the things they can probably do to make and break countries and things like that. The difference is having a direct military. That's a bit different. But then they have private institutions. They're part of the people who, when you have these massive military sales, it's probably companies like this that are involved in the assets and the paybacks and the sharing of these things. Because it's not like, oh, like United States sells some planes to Kenya. It's not like Kenya just has that money. It's like they get in
No.
a deal with an institution like BlackRock, and then BlackRock fronts the money back to the United States system that's been printed. So there's all these
Yeah.
issues that go in there. But yeah, oh no,
Well, that was like the thing with World War One and J.P. Morgan in England and France, where he underwrote the war bond. So the idea was when the money that they were borrowing to fight the war, they'd have to pay back to J.P. Morgan. So that's why he wanted them to win, because if they lost the war, like let's say Germany had defeated them, if Germany could have either have taken them over or left them alone, but either way, it's sorry, we don't have money to pay for you. So bankers like him, they wanted that side to win the war because they'd be like, okay, pay up, you owe us. No.
Yeah. And that's part of the things that, in a way, it kind of makes me kind of think, knowing about things like this,
Yeah.
makes you kind of think where I don't really see a world war happening again because it'd just be
Yeah.
too expensive for people like these who actually have the influence. They're not going to let China and the United States of America go to war. Like, who would finance that actual war? Like,
Yeah.
there's too many assets people like these would stand to lose. Like your average person's like, I hate China, or your average
Yeah.
Chinese person's like, the United States is a big evil. But then when it actually comes to actually having a war, they would have to have somebody like BlackRock, these type of people, be actually invested into it, and I can't see them being invested in a war over peace trade war type of cultural war situations.
Well, because it's one of those things like whichever side wins, technically they lose because it's like China gets nuked or just even like heavily damaged. Well, there goes the factories. We're not producing this stuff, but then we get wiped out. Well, who's going to buy this stuff? So it's like either way, it's an ugly situation.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
All right. So this is the last paragraph I picked. It's pretty long, but I think it's good. Let's see here.
Okay.
The idea of a new type of man as the member, quote in parentheses, though not as the builder of a socialist society, appears in Marx and Engels. In the concept of the quote unquote all around individual free to engage in the most varying activities. In the socialist society, corresponding to this idea, the free development of individual faculties would replace the subjection of the individual to the division of labor. But no matter what activities the all-around individual would choose, they would be activities which are bound to lose the quality of freedom if exercised in quote-unquote en masse, and they would be quote-unquote en masse, for even the most authentic socialist society would inherit the population growth and mass basis of advanced capitalism. The early Marxian example of the free individuals alternating between hunting, fishing, criticizing, and so on had a joking, ironical sound from the beginning, indicative of the impossibility, anticipating the ways in which liberated human beings would use their freedom. However, the embarrassingly ridiculous sound may also indicate the degree to which the vision has become obsolete and pertains to a stage of the development of the productive forces which has been surpassed. The later Marxian concept implies a continued separation between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, between labor and leisure, not only in time, but also in such a manner that the same subject lives in a different life in the two realms. According to the Marxian conception, the realm of necessity would continue under socialism to such an extent that real human freedom would prevail only outside the entire social sphere of socially necessary labor. Marx rejects the idea that work can ever become play. Alienation would be reduced with the progressive reduction of the working day, but the latter would remain a day of unfreedom, rational but not free. However, the development of the productive forces beyond their capital or capitalist organization suggests the possibility of freedom within the realm of necessity. The quantitative reduction of necessary labor could turn into quality, in parentheses, as freedom, not in proportion to the reduction, but rather to the transformation of the working day, a transformation which the stupefying, enervating, pseudo-automatic jobs of capitalist progress would be abolished. But the construction of such a society presupposes a type of man with a different sensitivity, as well as consciousness, men who would speak a different language, have different gestures, follow different impulses, men who have developed an instinctual barrier against cruelty, brutalness, ugliness. Such an instinctual transformation is conceivable as a factor of social change only if it enters the social division of labor, the production relations themselves. They would be shaped by men and women who have the good conscience of being human, tender, sensuous, who are no longer ashamed of themselves for the token of freedom. Attained that is no longer ashamed of ourselves. He's quoting Nietzsche, de Fröhliche Wissenschaft. I think that's the gay science, if I recall. The imagination of such men and women would fashion their reason and tend to make the process of production a process of creation. This is the utopian concept of socialism, which envisages the ingression of freedom into the realm of necessity and the union between causality and necessity and causality by freedom. The first would mean passing from Marx to Fourier, the second from realism to surrealism. Okay, there's a lot there, but I'll let you go fire away.
Okay, let's take it in parts. Um, what kind of production is not creation?
I think it's that whole thing of like during his time he was complaining about like sort of the I guess the assembly line type production, like, oh, these people are enslaved to this system, like that was the whole concept of alienation. Like I think Hegel's alienation was more spiritual, the Marxist one was material, like the idea of you're being used by the boss to make things, then he sells them, he makes the money, but you get a small part of that money. You don't get the full price of the product, so you're alienated from the final price. I think that's kind of the argument he's making here. Yeah. Because alienation,
Okay.
people misunderstand it. It's not like, oh, you're doing tedious work, you're bored, you feel distracted. It's you're somehow detached from the final product of your labor, and other people are making money off of it. Whereas ideally, you should be making the money because it's your labor. That's the argument. Yeah.
There is a situation of, I guess, creating something does not necessarily mean it's creative, because if you just follow like a recipe, you're not really being creative, but you are
Right.
creating something.
Yeah.
And I guess also with this, it kind of goes to the point where it's like they talk about the assembly line, but then I often look at people like musicians,
Yeah.
they come up with some song that people like, and then they go on tour, and it's just singing the same songs over
Yeah.
and over and over and over and over again. It was a creative process to come up with a song if they even wrote it themselves. And people might say, "Oh, that's a creative field." But why would they consider that to be creative, or part of that production that is that production of a process of creation? But they wouldn't consider an assembly line where the person is doing the same thing, putting the same widget into the vehicle and over again repeating that. That's kind of the same thing that the musician is doing. So I kind of I don't know
Well,
necessarily see where this goes.
this is sort of the labor theory of value, and I don't know if you know this, but they've been called the classical economists. We'll probably talk more about this in the section on human action, but how they sort of had the labor theory of value, and some people argue that Marx even plagiarized it from them. The idea that the price of a good is based on how much labor it costs to produce it. So, for example, I think it was the example that who was it, Ricardo or one of them cited, was that I think it was Smith actually. There were these nice stones that showed up on the beaches off of Scotland, and they were harvesting them and then selling them. So he was trying to use that to say, oh, look, they go out, they harvest them, that's work, they make money. But then the point that came up later with the Austrian economists is no, they're paying for the product itself. They don't care how much work went into achieve to get those. It could be, it could wash up and you could just grab it. You could spend days digging. It doesn't matter. They're paying for the final product itself. And I think that's sort of the disconnect here, is that you go to a concert to see a musician, you're paying money to hear the music, you want to see the person, you want them to wave at you, you're paying for that experience. It's not the physical effort of them being on stage and jumping around or whatever. It's the product itself that is the cost. And the criticism with the assembly line thing is, oh, well, it's the guy who runs the factory who's making most of the money, and he's just giving some of it to you. He's making money off your labor. You're not making money off the products you produce. But then, of course, Bernbovik, and that's his famous critique of Marx, was that no, because and Bernbovik's actually sympathetic. He says, no, I want workers to get the full price of of the product. But then he makes a point, well, you have to understand that, okay, people have to invest in that factory. They usually either owe debt or they've paid so much money themselves, they have to pay to maintain it, all this. The jobs only exist because of that funding. And it's also, he gets into low versus high time preference. Again, we'll get more into that later, but the idea that the workers want to get paid here and now. The people who built the factory, they're willing to make more money over the long run. So they're willing to pay the workers to do the work now if it means more money long term. But those are agreements, because the worker is saying, I want this job because I want to make money in the here and now. The factory owner says, I'll spend a few million to invest in this factory, but I don't expect to make a few million in the near future. It's going to be over years or whatever. And usually in those cases, those types of people will have multiple factories or multiple businesses where they can earn enough that it provides a good living. Then over time, they make way more than they started with. If that's, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I think I'm looking into getting into NFTs. I want to study that,
Yeah.
to do some art. So I think that might be something to get into. And they're talking about specifically the music industry, how that might actually end up evening some of the things. Because for a long time in the past, like we're talking, I think in the previous one we talked about how something like "Ode to Joy" is now in public domain, but
Yeah.
to actually the music, the sheet music is, but not the recordings of it, because you
Yeah.
actually have different people who actually do it. So if you can have access to the sheet music, you're not going to have access to the entire orchestra to play it. So
Yeah.
there used to be certain limitations, and the people who were actually running radio stations, who had the infrastructure to get things out there, pay for the tours, that used to be a different kind of situation. But now you get to the point where a musician can come up and just have a computer, make their own tracks and everything, put it out there, but they still have to go through the actual companies and things in general to get the distribution things out there. And for the tours, you can do different things like Airbnb, you can organize that stuff, but then still there's some costs. And now they're saying with NFTs, like specifically the music industry, people might be able to just create the music, then the artist can say, instead of just getting that lump sum now to pay for their time as the studio keeps the rights and gets this thing spread out over a longer amount of time, they can just say, okay, we have this song out, we have an album out, and then it's going to cost 10 Dogecoin. And then every time somebody buys it from that first person who bought it, they get a percentage. So there might be ways to actually get that are kind of interesting to see. And again, that's very private sector type of things coming up to change some of the things.
Well,
Okay.
even the concept of a franchise, like the idea of like this person runs this McDonald's, there's a whole central leadership and all this, but the idea of, okay, you pay so much money, you run this McDonald's and you have certain sales quotas and all this, but you're making money off of that brand name that they've established. So there's things like that where it's like, the risk to reward ratio, I'd say, is probably lower because McDonald's is a sure thing people are going to eat there. But at the same time, you're sort of constrained in the concept of it's not your menu. You have to do what they want. So that's the challenge. Whereas if you go off on your own, you could come up with something more creative and ultimately be very successful. But at the same time, it's riskier because you don't have that big name and funding and everything behind you. So, yeah.
Yeah. Now here says Marx rejects the idea that work can ever become play. And now there's people who, this channel called Twitch, and then there's professional gamers and there's athletes who go, why is LeBron James paid $10 million to play a game? You have Megan Rapinoe coming out and saying, oh, like the women's team is being paid less for the same work. And I'm like, hey, well, why don't you put it globally and say every women's football team, women's football, soccer team in the world should be paid the same amount as the U.S. national team. The U.S. national team, I'm sure, is being paid a lot more than the Kenyan female national team, but they're both women. They both play the same game, so why should Megan Rapinoe get more? But so they talk about this thing. But regardless, I understand the difference of the demand of the people who actually want the thing. That's for me. But people say this is a game. But then when it comes down to it, I also understand that the athletes themselves put in a lot of work. Even when talking about the gamers and things like that, people who are actually professionally, people like I think Ninja is one of the most popular streamers of video games and things like that. He makes like millions a year playing games online, playing games like Fortnite and things like that. But for him, it's work, but it's still a game. And then how much of actual other things that we do are not really gamified in some kind of sense. So in this sense, I would wonder what Marx would mean by saying the difference between like work becoming play and that kind of situation. Or people who, or the expectation that some people have to say like, oh, if you find something you enjoy doing, then you'll never have to work another day in your life. Would they consider that to be play?
I just find the absurdity of this coming from a guy who never worked a day in his life. It's like, what is he? I mean,
that's the thing.
I don't want to just dismiss his philosophy with ad hominem, but it's like some of this stuff, like, he didn't go into a factory. He just read what Engels wrote about it. Then like, complaining about the oppressed workers and the evil capitalist class when Engels was literally supporting him off of factory workers. So it's just, I don't know. It's like, I want to be charitable to a point, so I'm not just misrepresenting him, but I mean, some of the stuff, it's just, I don't know.
But that's the thing. What is work? And that would again go to his definition of work. And if he was saying workers, and that it seems to be what they say, they talk about the working class. I don't think he would consider himself to be part of the working class, and that's why I don't like that term, because I say, what really is work? Like sitting there and being a writer. If a writer decides I'm going to go to I'm going to go to seclude myself in some small town somewhere for for a year to write this book, just constantly just waking up every day, writing this thing. Are they working? Like, because they enjoy what they're doing? Is that play? Like, so in that sense, I would consider that work. But would Marx consider that to be worker? Because that's kind of the things that he was doing. So that's the thing, like, what is work? Like, who gets to really decide what is work and what is play? And because a lot of people that we think are playing, to them, they're actually working a lot harder than when we do this. People are like, oh, it's a game. Like, I can just go out there and play basketball. It's like, yeah, you can. But if LeBron stepped on that court, he would destroy you. So, because for him, that's work. For you, it might be play. It might be a game. It's kind of
because it's the same thing with actors. Like, people are like, oh, they just get on screen and do this, but it's like, okay, you have to remember the lines. You have to look good. You have to be able to act, obviously, in the character. You have millions of people watching you. Of course, if you slip up, that's it's not just like, okay, you show up and make money. It's not.
Yeah. And I think another thing you mentioned here, talking about the working day transformation is stupefying, enabling, and that's the thing. Like when people talk about the working day, that's another new convention. When
Yeah.
like I think it came up in the last part where people were saying the expectation, where people are like, oh, I have to work, I have to earn a living. It's like, no, that's a common thing.
Yeah.
Every life form has to do certain actions, has to work in a sense, has to do activities that could be considered work in order to continue to be alive. So that's a common thing. It's even like the 40-hour work week that is actually being reduced in the West due to the magnificent time-saving devices that we've developed is a boon to civilization, because
Yeah.
this whole idea of having the weekends off, that was not something that used to exist.
No.
It's like, no, it was 24/7. Like you'll be
Yeah.
working all the time. This whole idea that, oh, we need days off of work, we need like leave for things. It's like, no, that's not how it was. Maternal leave and all these are completely new social
Yeah.
conventions, social constructs due to the benefits of living in an advanced society that exists. Like that's not the way it's been. And we need more of this. We need more being able to like harness fossil fuels, harness reliable energy, and being able to use that to convert that and use like Alex Epstein puts this in excellent ways. Like a machine, we live in a machine labor world, and that's the kind of things that have given us many of these benefits and things like that. Even people like Marx, due to this machine labor world with the printing presses and having the ability to get information around, get these ideas out there, is part of why some of these things have been able to proliferate as much as they can. This is like the power went out here earlier. If we did have power at all, I wouldn't be able to even record this conversation
Yeah.
and have it to begin with, let alone read this content. So
Yeah.
there's so many things that I think people don't really appreciate and understand how great of a time that it is that we live today. And that's the thing I kind of wonder with Marcuse. What was Marcuse's opinion about his history, and what would his opinion change living in today's time about the times that he was writing? That'd be very interesting. It's like the constant thing that I continue to think about when I read this stuff.
Well, and like Bob Murphy pointed out, like not only the working hours shorter, but how much time do we actually spend working? You're not hammering away in a mine for 14 hours, whatever. It's like you spend a lot of time on your phone, a lot of time on social media. You get water breaks, you get lunch breaks. Like you add that up, like physically, how hard are you pushing yourself compared to our ancestors? Yeah.
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 And we might think, oh, we're doing this one thing. It's this one minor thing. But then when you do those pushing and things, how many other people's work has been related to actually get to that computer to be there for you to begin with, to actually
Yeah.
do those things? And then when you hit those keystrokes, those few keystrokes that you do, how many people's activities can be directed 2, 3 people away from you based off those few keystrokes? It's an amazing thing to really consider and think
Yeah.
about when you actually grasp some of these things.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think that was pretty much it for this paragraph. I don't know if there's something else
It's
in
pretty
there.
long. Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of the whole Soviet new man thing, and that's basically what he's getting at here. The difference I find interesting is that Marx saw it as the dialectical materialism. Everything was just through the lens of class struggle and all this, whereas Marcuse actually believed in biology. He believed in all this about repression and all that. So in a way, he draws from Marx, but also sort of turns him on his head a bit. Because again, Marx didn't really talk much of, he didn't talk about evolution, I don't think. And oh no, wait, hold on. I think, what was it? Das Kapital was going to be dedicated to Darwin or something, but Darwin said no. There was some story with that, yeah, there was some story with that. But the thing is, Marx himself did not talk a lot about like biology, like, oh, he didn't. That's why, to your point, I wonder what they would say if they were alive today with evolutionary psychology and things like that. Like, how would they react to those things?
Yeah. Speaking about Darwin with evolution, and there's one more thing I remembered that I wanted to point out from this. With the Darwin's evolution thing, like people don't say, like the Galapagos Islands thing, when he landed there and he started writing about the concept of evolution, which is rather accepted right now. That was 1835.
Yeah.
Like he was 22. He was 22 when he did that.
Wow.
1835. Like I think if you ask most people, they might think it was like 500 years ago. But like imagine if he'd done that today. Like let's say somehow we'd managed to develop all the technology that we had without the knowledge that Darwin has helped with evolution and things like that. And then he just got there. How long would it have taken for his ideas about evolution to spread around the world if he was actually there live streaming it, having a YouTube channel, things like people could actually watch it and things like that can actually spread around? Because some of the ideas that he's thought of, there's still majority of people in the I don't know. I think still majority of the people in the world don't really understand the concept, the basic premise of evolution. They normally mischaracterize it ridiculously, and it's something that is rather accepted and practical. Now, what is it going to be in 100 years from now when we can say majority of the people of the world actually realize and understand those things? And that's kind of what's happening right now. Certain ideas that could be really life-changing don't need to take the epochs that it used to take in the past for that information to actually spread around in the world and actually be absorbed into common sense of what it actually is. There's many positive and very effective ideas that just disappeared, that were missed because, like a situation with Darwin, 100 years before Darwin, he wrote the book. So even if he died on the way back, somehow it would have gotten out there. But it used to be like an expedition. Somebody 200 years before Darwin might have figured out evolution to even more concise sense than Darwin did. But then on his way out, a mosquito bit him, he got malaria and died. And then the idea was just lost from human knowledge. But we had different advancements where now he doesn't even have to come back. He can just like send it on some wire to some satellite and come, and you have that information transferred somewhere in the cloud. So that's one thing that I was thinking with that. Kind of interesting that they had those ratios. And you see that with those people, it was still a very tiny group of people that history is about.
Yeah.
You look at history with the millions of people that have lived. When you're writing history, it's really the majority of human history is actually the story about a million humans, about that. But there's been billions of humans over that entire time. But it really focuses on the stories and the experiences that only a million humans or so actually experiences, and that's the entirety of human history. Now, how many people do you have a day writing stuff on Twitter that's seen by millions of people? So it kind of seems like it could seem like the world is getting dumber and more inane. But it's just like in the past, we didn't hear about the thoughts of the millions of other people that we do now. So take heart. It's not as bad just hearing about more people. So anything I'd say on that?
There was actually an interesting book called The Lagoon, How Aristotle Invented Science, and it talked a lot about Aristotle's biology, especially on the island of Lesbos, where he dissected all these animals. And it was really interesting because it showed how far forward-thinking Aristotle was, because he identified sort of like not exactly the same classifications we have today, but like the precursor to that, like the idea of, okay, these creatures give birth to their young live, these creatures lay eggs. I guess he was fascinated with the cuttlefish because the idea is like, where does this ink come from and why does it come out? I guess he identified some of the organs. He didn't get their functions exactly right, but he had an idea. And then Darwin said later of Aristotle, he said, all these other scientists are schoolboys compared to Aristotle. And I think it's very interesting because, Aristotle definitely got things wrong, physics and all that, but a lot of his biology, as far as I know, was really solid, and a lot of it held up and went on to influence people later. And you have to remember, as you're saying, like, he didn't have microscopes, he didn't have all this, like he just had a knife in his eyes and ears.
Yeah. I think one last thing to wind this down is over here they're talking about, he said Marx an example of the free individuals alternating between hunting, fishing, criticizing, and so on. And we're talking about how history rhymes. And with Marxian ideology, with the things that Marcuse was writing, with the current year, people thinking, oh, we've invented this whole new field, this whole new progressive ideas, we're doing something so brand new. It's not brand new.
No.
It's a continual thing. I think it breaks down to the whole like individualism versus collectivism. There's ways of viewing the world come from those two things. Like, and I don't know which one comes first. Do human beings somehow sentiently in the womb come to some acknowledgement that they're part of at least a two life system where they're like growing in another life form? Or is it a situation where they come to the point where once they're born, they understand that they're actually a separate being outside of everything else that's experiencing? They recognize their individual self, and then once they've recognized themselves as an individual, then they start absorbing the collections of things that led to them being the being that they are, the individual being that they are. Then from that duality of awareness of the existence of people existing in this existence, like they kind of get to understand where some things lean more to individuals, as this is me as an individual being, and this is me informed as part of these different collection of things, like me interacting with all these other things, or me thinking this way or being here due to the result of all these other things, versus the things that me as an individual can do to move forward and then also now affect these other things. So I think there's that kind of rhyming and repetition that kind of comes with some of these things.
Yeah. It's hard to say.
Yeah, so that's it.
Oh yeah, and then I thought it was what else was I going to say anything here? It's interesting that he mentions Fourier, because Fourier was one of the utopian socialists. He was the one who coined the term feminism. So I thought that was interesting. He mentions him. Then he talks about realism versus surrealism in the next section, which we'll do next time he gets into art. And I think that's interesting, the idea of realism versus surrealism. And I know Theodore Adorno had some criticisms of art, and postmodernism itself actually started in regards to art, because the idea of beauty is not objective, it's subjective, it's socially constructed, and a lot of that art is more about making a statement rather than expressing beauty. Like there was the guy Duchamp who he just painted a urinal, and I guess the message was art is something to be pissed on. That was but like it's not about expressing beauty, it's about expressing a statement. So he sort of gets into that in the next section, but I thought it was interesting mentioning those at the bottom.
Yeah, I don't think he painted the urinal. I think he posted the urinal as a
he just
art.
posted it.
He just put it up there, and he hung it up on the wall as an art piece, and that was the kind of thing. This kind of thing, like I wish I was more into philosophy. I was into philosophy, I just didn't pay that much attention to like art history classes. So, but with the connection of postmodernism, it did come up when we were talking about the critical theory thing. So I might look into doing a series where I get more into the connection between the artistic movement of postmodernism and the more theological. I actually think it's more theological in the social kind of sphere sense of it. See the connections between them. But yeah, and also with realism and surrealism, I think realism would be more towards individualism and surrealism is more to collectives, since the individual is individual. In reality, we are just who we are. But when you talk about collectives, that's more surreal. Like, what is the collective? What is your race? What is your family? That is more some subjective type of surreal type of thing where there is no actual real entity as family, but we have some kind of identification of it. But there actually is some entity as Silas, as Stephen. But then friends, Silas and Stephen, that's more of a surreal entity. That's kind of it. So yeah, I don't know.
It's interesting. All right.
So that's it.
Yeah, that's it. That's all I have for that section. Figure do the next one
It
next time.
seems we might be able to just do these in sections and things like that. It's been about 2 hours for this one, and the next section is the new sensibility that we shall get to recording tomorrow, maybe, or sometime this week.
Should be good. Yeah.
Yeah. For those listening, thank you very much. Let us know in the comment section. As you said, this essay will be there. You can go ahead and read it for yourself, and then come back and listen to the other parts, or you can just wait for the other parts to come out. Much appreciated. And yeah, I think that's it for me.
Okay.
All right, so Stephen, just stay on for a little bit after. And for me, goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, bye. Thanks.